The enormous number of accidents in which people have died throughout history shows us how fragile human existence is, but others, as is the case that concerns us today, demonstrate the opposite. How can a person survive the injuries Mr. Phineas Gage suffered? It's quite a mystery. How is it possible that an iron bar pierces your skull and you get up on your own foot to go to the doctor? Worse yet, the calamity that Phineas would be subjected to due to that injury only makes his case one of the most graphic and chilling I have ever seen. You are warned. Phineas P. Gage was born in Grafton County, New Hampshire, on the 8th of July, 1823. We know that he was born into a family of farmers and grew up surrounded by animals and farm fields. He was the oldest of 5 siblings, but little else is known of his youth, until he decided to enlist as a railroad construction worker for a company called Rutland and Burlington. Those who knew him before his accident said of him that he was a man in the prime of life, very healthy and very active in terms of his work and his ambitions. He was 1.67 meters tall, which by the standards of the time was considered quite tall. He was in excellent physical condition and rarely got sick. Gage could read and write, which was also an advantage in the mid-19th century. He was known to have a healthy obsession with explosives, which would lead him to get a job in which his role was aligned with his hobby. Phineas is believed to have worked with gunpowder and dynamite on certain farms and mines until 1845, the year in which we can affirm that he was already working as a blasting foreman on the construction of the Hudson River Railroad. The use of explosive for construction and mineral extraction has been practiced since the 9th century, and today it is still used for the same purpose. Dynamite sticks are detonated with pre-made electrical charges from a safe distance, but in the mid-19th century, explosive practices weren't so modern. Usually, a thin, deep hole was drilled in the rock. Then, gunpowder was put into the opening, a fuse was installed, sand was added as a plug. Next, an iron bar was introduced to press the explosive as if it were a musket. This process was done by blasters, and Phineas was one of the best. But being very good at your job does not exempt you from the risks involved in such a dangerous activity. On September 13, 1848, at 4:30 p.m., Mr. Gage was working with his crew near Cavendish, Vermont. His task was to blow the rock into pieces so that it could be transported out of the area where the train would later pass. And for that, the first step was to drill a hole in the rock of a specific depth, diameter and angle, so that the explosion would be as effective as possible. Phineas' specific job was to keep the men who were drilling the rock in check. He also controlled those who transported the pieces far from the place, and with his assistant he prepared the explosives before detonating them. The routine was very strict. His assistant loaded the hole with gunpowder. Phineas used the fine point of his iron rod to drive the fuse inside. Then the assistant filled the hole, this time with sand as a plug. With the thick point of the iron rod, Gage had to compact the sand to increase the intensity of the explosion. To finish, they just had to light the fuse, warn everyone and move away. But at that moment, something did not go as planned. The sand was never dumped into the hole. Was it the assistant's fault or Phineas's fault for not looking? The witnesses never agreed on that detail. What they did mention was that Phineas was near the hole with the stick halfway through. At that moment, but something distracted him. It is not known if someone called him by his name or if he was controlling any of his men who made the bomb. But for some reason, Phineas turned his head to the right when the iron bar slipped out of his hand and fell into the hole, hitting the rock and creating sparks that detonated the explosive. What happened next, I want you to imagine in slow motion. Imagine that you are located inside Phineas's head and you see the pointed part of the stick fly out of the hole like a bullet. The bar pierced through his left cheekbone, passing behind his eye, through the center of his brain and coming out through his skull, at the height where the hairline is. The bar was in and out in a split second and landed 25 meters away, covered in blood and pieces of brain. Phineas fell to the ground in a crash and stood there for a couple of minutes, convulsing as his teammates swirled around him through the powder smoke. But the faces of horror became faces of surprise when Gage began to speak, answering the pleas of his companions. His face was covered in blood. They were able to sit him down, and soon he was able to stand up and walk without any help. He was immediately put into a carriage that transported him to the room where he was staying at the hotel owned by Joseph Adams in Cavendish. One of his men took a horse and went straight to find the doctor while they transported him. When he got to the hotel, he got off the carriage by himself and climbed the steps to the entrance. There, he sat on the porch next to the owner of the hotel. He told him that shortly before he had seen the rider who was running in search of the town doctor, Dr. Hallow, when he arrived at his clinic, but he was not there, so they told him to go to the next town to find Dr. Williams. Meanwhile, on the porch, Phineas told Mr. Adams what had happened. And that's where Dr. Williams found Phineas Gage half an hour later. Among the crowd of walkers and onlookers, Gage looked up and said calmly to the doctor as he approached, "It seems you have enough work here." The doctor examined Phineas. He could not believe that this man was still alive. His skull was wide open, as if it had exploded from the inside out. Certainly, accident victims are often too nervous or out of their minds to speak clearly and explain what happened. So the doctor turned to ask his co-workers, but Mr. Gage insisted that he could relate what happened as well as any witness. While Phineas told the doctor what happened, he began to feel sick to the point of vomiting. In his notes, the doctor stated that the patient vomited violent blood, and that with the pressure of strong nausea, half a cup of tea of brain was expelled through the hole in his skull. The doctor still didn't believe it, and actually wrote that by now the patient should already be dead. While the doctor was inspecting and questioning him, the town doctor, Dr. John Martin Harlow, arrived. After a few words, they decided that Dr. Harlow would handle the case, and he had Phineas enter his room to treat the wound. The patient climbed the stairs to his room unaided and lay down on his bed so that the doctor could shave his head and see the wound better. What he saw was astonishing. The iron bar that had pierced his head had broken his skull as it came out of him, leaving the brain in full view. The doctor cleaned the skin around the wound, removed the bone fragments and clots along with about 30 grams of brain piece by piece, and very delicately put the entire pieces of the skull bones in place. He then inspected the entrance hole of the bar in his face, decided to leave the hole in the palate open so that the wound would have a drainage outlet. What he did do was put the skin on his cheek back in place to cover the hole and tape it down. He then put a bandage on Phineas's head and covered it with a pajama cap to keep it in place. It was only then that he saw the burns on the patient's arms and forearms, cleaned them, and told him to rest and, above all, not to move. Mr. Gage should have died long before he could even reach the hotel due to the shock. Even if it was not the case, the great loss of blood should have been his end. If not, the cause of the death should have been the inflammation of the brain after the impact. But according to the doctor, having suffered the skull break in such an exaggerated way was what saved him from the last. After 24 hours of lying in bed, he seemed to improve. His wound stopped bleeding, and he was encouraged, even joking with the doctor. "It's okay if I don't see my friends today, since I'll be back at work in a couple of days," Gage said. But the next day, things got worse. His fever rose, and he began to have delusions, all while his brain was oozing with a full-smelling liquid, a clear sign of infection. The doctor prepared himself for the worst, since a bacterial infection in the brain at that time was a sign of imminent death. In 1884, little did we know about bacteria, although they had already been discovered 2 centuries earlier, since the invention of the microscope. But it was not used as a medical instrument, so the bacteria were not associated with infections, let alone antibiotics. Mr. Gage was doomed. 12 days after the incident, he continued to have a very high fever, and even with the doctor's care, under the bandages, a fungus began to sprout in his brain, reopening his wounds. Large amounts of pus were expelled through his mouth, his head, and the hole where his left eye used to be. That same day, his family and friends made preparations for his mass and his burial. But Dr. Harlow did not think the same, and he believed that if he did not do everything possible to cure that man, he would not forgive himself. So he set out to heal the wound at any cost, removing the fungal infected parts of the brain and applying silver nitrate to disinfect the area. The days passed, and Dr. Harlow performed the same procedure over and over again, changing the bandages and trying to keep the wound clean. Whether it was treatment, luck, some kind of miracle, or all the above, Mr. Gage's condition began to improve. 24 days after the accident, he was able to get out of the bed and sit in a nearby chair. 54 days, he was able to leave the hotel and take a short walk for the first time. And 10 weeks later, he was able to return to his parents' residence in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Soon after, he could take short walks, count, eat, dress himself, and even sing. He could understand what was being said to him without problems and answer appropriately. During the spring of 1849, Phineas was back in Cavendish for a final medical examination and asked to be allowed to go back to work building the railroad, and so they allowed him. But soon his co-workers realized that he was no longer the same. He was constantly angry, insulted the workers and spent the day cursing. According to them, he was no longer the same Gage they had known. Later that year, a Harvard University professor named Henry Jacob Bigelow became interested in the case. Dr. Harlow had sent letters to several doctors before, but none of them found the case relevant because they couldn't believe it. But Dr. Bigelow did decide to find out what happened and went to visit Phineas. Within days, he appeared with him at the Boston Society for Medical Improvement, and from that moment on, Gage tried to take advantage of his circumstances by exposing himself and his iron bar, which he carried everywhere, at the Barnum Museum in New York, and charging for the ticket. Soon after, his case lost notoriety and he moved to Chile to work as a long-distance stagecoach driver for 8 years. It was in 1859 that his health began to deteriorate and he returned to his family, who had moved to San Francisco. He died in May 1860 due to a severe epileptic seizure caused by the aftermath of the accident. 6 years later, Dr. Harlow asked the family if he could exhume Gage's body and keep his cult to donate to science. Family accepted, and the doctor took the opportunity to write the final article on Gage. To this day, both the skull and the rod are in the Warren Anatomical Museum in Boston. Gage's case is remembered as one of the first cases of personality alteration due to an accident. There are people in the world who are truly formidable. Anyone else in Gage's place would possibly have died instantly. But Phineas was another kind of animal. Despite the tragedy, he survived and was able to live his life normally to some extent. If you liked the video, give it a like, you help me a lot. Here are some other chilling stories in case you want to take a look at them. See you in the next video.